What is happening, everybody? Today we're going to be talking about S-Log2 and how to color correct it and how to add a little bit of a cinematic color grade to that footage. So I recently went out and shot some footage for the purposes of making this video. We're going to start by taking a look at that, and then from there I'll talk you through the step-by-step process I did to achieve that final look. Let's check it out. There you have it, and I think that came out pretty well. One thing that you've got to know before color correcting or color grading or any of that is getting your exposure right. Now with S-Log2 that tends to be a little bit tricky, and what I'm going to recommend is exposing 2 stops over. Now by doing that, you're retaining information in your shadows that would have otherwise been lost, and then would have resulted in a grainy looking image. If you guys want me to do a tutorial on how to correctly expose S-Log2 footage, let me know in the comments below, and that's something I can do in future. So color correction and color grading, 2 separate things, both serve a different purpose. Let's start with the first one, which is color correction. This is what you do first, and the reason why you do this is to get all of your footage sitting at a baseline. So you might have shot in S-Log2, another camera HLG3, maybe you've shot in completely different camera systems, and so your footage looks really different coming out of camera. The purpose of color correction is to get it all looking standard across the board before you add the color grade, which is your style or your cinematic look on top of all of that to give the feel that you want for your footage. What can be really useful before you start color correcting is knowing the picture profile that you're shooting in. So I know that S-Log2 tends to be desaturated, low contrast, no real black or white point, but rather just a variation of gray. And it does that in order to help you maintain your dynamic range. Let's jump into Premiere and I'll show you how knowing that information is going to help you getting your color correction spot on. Here we are in Premiere, and the first thing you're going to want to do is navigate to your color corrections tab. So that's one right up over here. You're going to click that and you're going to get an interface that looks similar to this. I've customized mine so yours might not look exactly the same, but more or less this is what you'll be playing with. So you can see on the left hand side here is the footage from the clip that I showed you earlier in this video. Now what I did was I pulled 2 of the clips from that sequence, and then we're going to be working on those 2. That's this clip over here and then this clip over here, and I'm going to show you how to color correct and then color grade. First things first is we're going to be working on adjustment layers and not on the actual clips themselves. So you're going to come across and you're going to start a new item, adjustment layer, and typically Premiere is going to match those sequence settings for you. You're going to hit OK, drag it across. I'm going to pull it across my 2 clips and then I'm going to cut them in the middle, so you've got 1 adjustment layer for the first clip and 1 adjustment layer for the second clip. So let's go back to the first one. And before we start color grading, I'm going to take you through the lumetri scopes and give you a bit more of understanding of what these graphs mean and how you can interpret them. So I'm going to come across here and I'm going to get rid of the parade RGB. So all we're working with is the vector scope right over there and the waveform luma right over here. Now if you don't have that, hit the little wrench tool and you can select whichever waveforms you want to be seeing. I typically don't clamp my signal, so I set clamp signal to off, and you'll see why later in the clip. So let me explain to you what these 2 charts are telling us. This chart right over here are your color values and the way that they're dispersed throughout the image. So as we can see, there's not a lot of color in this image right now. Why? Because S-Log2 is a desaturated image right out of the camera. So if we come across to the lumetri panel here, and make sure to be doing your adjustments on the adjustment layer, not on the clip itself. So select the adjustment layer and take a look at this chart right over here. As I pump the saturation up, look at it increasing. That white mass grows closer to your reds, your magentas, your cyans, your yellows, closer to your different colors, and that shows you the representation of the color in the image. On the right hand side, what you see here is your luma scope. So it's showing you the luminance of the image. So as you can see in the image itself, the highlights are really white and probably blown out over there, and that's a representation of it right over there. You can see it's a little bit darker in the image in this area, no real bright spots, and that corresponds to your graph on the luminance scale over here. 100 being pure white, 0 being pure black. And again, S-Log2, knowing that picture profile, we know that nothing is really going to be pure black on the 0 or pure white on the 100, because S-Log2 tends to condense the colors, and then you can push them out again to select your white or your black value. So let's go back to our base. I'm going to bring the saturation back down to what it was right out of camera, and then here's where we start using that fundamental knowledge of S-Log2 to color correct our image. So what I'm going to do first is introduce more saturation into the image to try and get it looking closer to what it looked like when I was actually filming. That's the whole purpose of color correction, to get it to look as true to life as possible. So we're going to pump up the saturation because we know S-Log2 is a desaturated picture profile, and that looks okay for now. What we're going to do then is we're going to bring our black level slightly down, and this is why I don't clamp my signal. Can you see how the black has dropped to below the 0? So sometimes I like it to sit just below the 0 there, so I want the black to just touch below 0. White, now I don't have a pure white point in this image whatsoever, and I don't necessarily want that blown out section over here to be pure white either, so I'm going to push my whites up slightly just to below touching over there. So that looks pretty good to me. So we've set our black value and our white value, and now we need to introduce some more contrast into this image. So we're going to go across like that, and you can see that also affects our white and our black value. So I'm going to adjust a little bit more, get a touch more black into the image. And now you might have noticed that this entire process isn't entirely dependent on what we're seeing on the scopes here. It also has a lot to do with what your eye is seeing. So it's a fluid process, and don't think that you're going to get it perfect because you've got the technical details of it perfect. You'll get better at it as time goes and the more experience you have. So looking at this, that's looking okay and true to life as to what it actually looked like when I was shooting. Now another really important part here is getting your white balance correct. So I've made all of these adjustments and it's looking okay so far, but I want to adjust my white balance. And what we can do if we don't have a pure white point in the image is we can start looking at this vector scope right over here, and if this white mass is kind of in the center, that's going to give us a fair indication that our white balance is on point. So how do we adjust that? We can come into our temperature and our tint sliders. So I'm going to move this a little bit more towards the blue side, and that's more centered, so very slight adjustment. We've seen that white mass come across. We need a bit more magenta. This image is looking very green and yellow, so we move that slightly, just a touch, and I think the white balance is looking alright. Another way to confirm whether or not your white balance is close to what it needs to be is to use your skin tones. So I'll show you how to do that right now. We're going to go away from the basic correction into the HSL secondary. We're going to select red because that's typically where your skin tones lie in. We're going to hit color gray. We can see it starts to isolate the red areas of the image. Now I don't want all of this jacket or the roof of the car over here, so I'm going to pull my saturation back so it's more or less just my skin tones, and you can see it's pretty splotchy. So what we're going to do is we're going to come into the denoise and blur just to get it looking a little bit more even, and then we can take a look at the vector scope over here with our color distribution, and what we want is those skin tones to hit this line right over here. Now that's known as the skin tone line. So regardless of the ethnicity of the person, their skin will always fall on the skin tone line. As you can see, ours is looking a little bit too red, so I'm going to scroll down here and I'm going to see what happens if I push a little bit more green in. That's not looking too good, it's kind of condensing it, so I'm going to start using the color wheel there, and it's falling a bit better onto that line. So let's take the color in gray away, and that's looking alright to me. Let's take one more look. I feel like I can up the saturation maybe slightly on this. So let's bring a little bit more saturation in. Let's take a look at it now. Yeah, that looks alright. And again, like I said, there's a bit of eyeballing going on here, so you want to make sure that the image looks good to you. Now, one more thing that I typically tend to do with S-Log is I want to get more deeper, richer blacks. So I'm going to scroll up to here, and I'm going to go into my curves panel. I'm going to create a slight bit of contrast by giving us an S-curve, something like that, and then another little point there, just to give us deeper blacks. So let's do a before and after here. So that's before. As you can see, a desaturated, low contrast, no real black or white point in the image. We know that's what S-Log is. So we start tweaking those to bring the image back to a closer to true life representation. And there you have it. So that looks a lot better to me. Now let's jump into our second image and apply those same principles. This time I'm going to go a little bit quicker because I've already shown you the groundwork, but I'll still talk you through what's going on. So here we have the second image, and what this is a great example of how this Luma curve works. Observe as I walk through the frame what happens to your Luma curve. See, you can actually see me, those darker patches, see down here, walking through the brighter areas. So I'm going to go ahead quickly and color correct this one. I'm going to come in, look at my blacks, and I'm going to get my black levels closer to 0, just like that. I'm going to bring my whites up slightly, not so much at the clip, but just a little bit. I'm going to saturate the image to about that point. That's looking better. Bring some contrast back into it. That's looking alright. Now this image is looking a little bit warm to me, and so what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this vector scope here in conjunction with my temperature and tint sliders to try and get it closer to a white as my target is. So I'm going to hit this slider here, and I'm going to bring that mass so it's a little bit more centered. So as you can see, that mass is more centered. Let's go back to what it was before. It's a little bit warm, and we bring it down just a touch. That mass is more centered, and that looks much better to me already. Let's go down to our curves, and like I said, I like to introduce a little bit of an S curve into my S-Log footage and then crush the blacks even a little bit more. So let's switch that off and this off. So this is what we had with our basic correction, looking pretty good. Here we have our curves, and overall I think that looks like a pretty good image. The whole purpose of color correction is to get your footage to match side by side. You want it to look like they've both come from the same scene. Let's see if we've managed to achieve that. So this and this, the color values to me and the exposure looks pretty much the same. So that gives us a really good base to work with as we start our color grade. Now when it comes to the color grade, we start in the same place. We're going to pull an adjustment layer over our footage. We're going to extend it, but this time we're not going to split it across the different clips, because if we did our color correction properly, then we have an even base to work off of. So any color grading that we do on top of that is going to reflect evenly across both images, and it should be fairly seamless. There are times where you do need to do minor tweaks, and I think that will be the case here, but let's see how it goes. So we're going to get into our adjustment layer, Lumetri color panel, and what I want to do is I want to add a cool kind of cold moody effect to this footage. So I've come into my creative tab. I'm going to cool the shadows down by pulling the slider across, and I'm going to heat my highlights up. So if we take a look at that, before, after, you can see already it's got that bit more of a cold feel to it. We can play with our tint balance as well to make it even more cold. So this, we tend to push our highlights into our shadows. If we go to the negative, we push our shadows into our highlights. If we go to the positive, so I want it to be a little bit more cool looking. So before and after, I think that looks pretty good to me. Now this is where a lot of our color grading comes in, and that's in the curves panel. So So we're going to open up the curves panel, and we're going to scroll down and mainly be using our hue versus saturation, hue versus hue, hue luma, bit of luma saturation, and not so much saturation versus saturation curves. So what tends to happen is when you start pushing an image really far in the color grade, you might introduce magenta or green artifact into the image. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a couple of nodes here, and we're going to pull down the saturation of the magenta, we're going to pull down the saturation of the green, and that sort of puts us in a safer space in case there are any artifacts. Now you probably won't see much of a difference as we go through here, but we're playing it safe. Now in this image I've got a little bit of tree in the background here, and I want to edit that, so I'm going to go into my hues. So there's probably a little bit of orange and yellow in those trees, and a fair amount of green. I don't want to go too far into the red because that's where my skin tones are sitting. So I want to see how the trees on the outside are being influenced by this color here. So I want to give it more of a like browny tone. So before, after. Right, what we're going to do now as well is we're going to come to our luma saturation curve, and we're going to put some nodes on the lower end of the luma spectrum, so your blacks, and we don't want our blacks to have any color tint to it, so we're going to pull all the saturation out, and our whites on the high end of the luma, we're going to do the same thing over there. So you can see the difference here in the sky. The sky was tinted more yellow because of the highlights and shadows tint that we included, so when we put this curve on, the sky goes back to a more neutral color. Now I did say I wanted this to be a bit more moody, so what I'm going to do is introduce some more shadow into the image, and that's again going to be up here in my curves. So I'm going to put some nodes on and then pull it to get looking a little bit more moody, and I really like the way that that looks right over there. So all of the adjustments is done in our curves now. Let's go before and after. It's helping to create a bit more of a dramatic image. If anything, I want the image to be slightly more cold. So what I'm going to do is come through here into my color wheels and match. And in my shadows, I'm going to pull my shadows to get a little bit cooler. I'm going to warm my mid-tones up slightly. I'm going to keep my highlights around that region there. So that gives me a nice moody feel. So let's go before and after. Very subtle differences, but the image becomes a little bit cooler. I do notice that I want my midtones coming down a little bit, so in here I can drag my midtones, make them a bit darker, even my highlights a little bit darker, and let's sit over there with the shadow. So again over here before and after, that giving me a much moodier look, and I did those fine tweaks in the color wheels and match panel. Let's take a look at that second clip and see how the color grade translates across. Now in theory, if we got our color correction spot on, it should look pretty seamless moving through the two clips. There are times, however, we'll have to do some slight tweaking based on the nuances of the specific clip, which I suspect will be the case over here. Let's take a look. Right, so as we drag it across, I think that looks pretty good to me. I am going to do some individual tweaking to this clip, however, so I'm going to split the adjustment layer, and I'm going to come into the curves panel. I'm going to go down, and what I want to do is I want to make the sky pop a little bit more. So I'm coming to the hue luma, and I'm taking all of the blue luminance which you're going to find in the sky, or all of the hue, and I'm going to pull the luminance of that down to make that sky pop and look a bit more dramatic. So you can see a lot more dramatic there. Let's not overdo it. I don't want to introduce artifact into the image. That to me looks pretty good, a little bit more. And I also want to make that sky a little bit more teal. So I'm going to come in here, hue versus hue. I'm going to pull that up slightly. That looks better to me. And I want here to be a little bit more contrast between the sky and the sand. So I'm going to go for a little bit more orange in the sand. And that looks pretty good overall. So let's take a look there. I really like the look of that. That's pretty moody, pretty dramatic to me. Now what I want to do is add one more adjustment layer, and this is where I'm going to do a couple of little fine tweaks. So adjustment layer, I'm going to drop it on there, pull it across, and then go back to my Lumetri color. So what I want to do is I'm going to add a little bit of sharpness to my image. So under creative, I'm going to come and sharpen it somewhat. Let's set it at that level there, and then I want to add a vignette to draw attention. So that should be pretty good. Let's look across the two clips, and I really like the way that that looks. Let me bring down that teal effect slightly, and this is exactly what I was talking about earlier, in that it's a bit of an eyeball process as well. So you've got to take a look at it, and you've got to find out what works best for your image. To me, that looks pretty spot on. One last touch, and I'm going to add those cinematic bars. So I'm going to bring a crop in here. I'm going to my effects controls. I'm going to crop the top by 12%, bottom by 12% as well. Got those cinematic bars coming in. I'm going to adjust this ever so slightly. I'm going to pull that image down a little bit more to adjust for the bars. And there we have it. It's a color correction first to get everything working towards a baseline, and then it's the color grade to give the look and feel and the dramatic sense that you want for your clip, and then small little tweaks like adding the cinematic bars on the top and the bottom to really add the finishing touches to your clip. So let's take a look one more time. Remove all the effects before. As you can see, a tired, washed out image looking far better and far more cinematic. I really am a fan of that last one. If you've gotten to this point, you probably enjoyed this video, and I'd really appreciate a like and a subscribe, as I'll continue to roll out more content to improve the quality of your filmmaking. I do have some sample footage of HLG3, and I want to go through the same process with that, the color correction and the color grade. So look out for that one coming up soon. I'll catch you guys in the next one.